Billionaire CEO calls Virgin Black secretary stupid and lost $3.5 billion deal on the spot. Alyssa stepped forward. Her hands were steady as she opened the leather folder. Inside were two sets of documents. The fake ones Richard wanted the investors to see, and the real ones that showed exactly how he'd been lying to everyone for months. What would you do if your boss humiliated you in front of the most powerful people in the city? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. At 7:45 p.m., Richard Dalton owned half of Manhattan. By 7:47 p.m., he owned nothing, and it was all because of the quiet woman standing behind him. The ballroom on the 47th floor of the Goldman Tower sparkled like a jewelry box. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks. Men in $1,000 suits whispered about money that could buy small countries. Women in designer dresses laughed at jokes that weren't funny because the men telling them controlled their husbands' careers. Richard Dalton stood at the center of it all. 6 feet 2 inches of pure arrogance wrapped in Italian silk. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. Everyone called him the Iron Banker of Wall Street. Tonight, he was about to close the biggest deal in corporate history. $3.5 billion. Enough money to make him the most powerful man on the East Coast. Have you ever watched someone destroy their life in 2 minutes? Have you seen power crumble because of pure arrogance? Have you witnessed the exact moment when a king realizes his crown is made of paper? Behind Richard stood his secretary, Alyssa Carter. 26 years old, 5 feet 4 inches, wearing a simple black dress that cost less than Richard's tie. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun. Her hands held a leather folder containing the contract that would change everything. She looked nervous. Everyone assumed she was just another scared employee, afraid of making a mistake in front of important people. They had no idea. The investors gathered around the marble table. Tech moguls from Silicon Valley, hedge fund kings from Boston, real estate giants from Miami. They'd flown in from across the country to be part of Richard's empire. The cameras were rolling. Financial reporters from CNN, Bloomberg, and the Wall Street Journal had their microphones ready. This wasn't just a business deal. This was theater. Richard raised his champagne glass. Gentlemen, ladies, tonight we make history. This deal will reshape how America does business from coast to coast. The room erupted in applause. Richard's smile grew wider. He turned to Alyssa and snapped his fingers like she was a dog. The contracts, sweetheart. Don't just stand there looking pretty. Alyssa stepped forward. Her hands were steady as she opened the leather folder. Inside were two sets of documents. The fake ones Richard wanted the investors to see, and the real ones that showed exactly how he'd been lying to everyone for months. She looked at Richard. For just a second, something flashed in her eyes. Not fear, not nervousness, something else entirely. She handed him the real documents. Richard didn't notice at first. He was too busy soaking up the attention, too drunk on his own power. He started reading the numbers out loud to the investors. Page 1. Page 2. Everything sounded perfect. Then he got to page 3. His voice caught in his throat. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. The real numbers were there. The ones that showed his Florida properties were worthless swampland. The ones that proved he'd been inflating values by 400%. The ones that would send him to prison. What the hell is this? Richard's voice cracked like a whip across the silent room. Every eye turned to Alyssa. She stood there, perfectly calm, perfectly still, like she was watching a movie she'd already seen. You asked for the contracts, sir. Those are the contracts. Richard's face turned red, then purple. Veins bulged in his forehead. You stupid girl. You handed me the wrong papers. But the investors were already reading. Their faces changed from excitement to confusion to horror. The lead investor, a billionaire from California named Marcus Webb, looked up for the documents like he'd been slapped. Richard, what is this? These property values, they're completely different from what you showed us last month. It's a mistake. Richard screamed. He grabbed Alyssa by the arm, so hard she winced. This idiot's secretary mixed up the files. That's when it happened. The moment that destroyed everything Richard had built. He looked at Alyssa with pure hate in his eyes. The cameras were rolling. The microphones were recording. Every powerful person in the room was watching. "You're so stupid," he snarled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "How did someone like you even graduate high school? Did they lower the standards in whatever backwoods trailer park you crawled out of?" The room went dead silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming. Someone's champagne glass clinked against the marble table. Outside, traffic moved through the streets 47 floors below, but in that ballroom, time stopped. Marcus Webb set down his copy of the contract. His voice was quiet, but everyone heard every word. "The deal is off." Other investors started closing their folders. Phones came out as they called their lawyers. The reporters leaned forward, smelling blood in the water. "But what if I told you the woman he insulted wasn't the victim? She was the architect of his downfall." Richard tried to recover. He apologized. He begged. He offered better terms, lower prices, bigger profits. Nothing worked. The damage was done. Not just the numbers on the papers, but the words he'd said. The cruelty he'd shown. The mask that had slipped to reveal the monster underneath. Within 20 minutes, $3.5 billion vanished. Contracts were torn up. Partnerships dissolved. Richard's stock price started falling like a stone dropped from a roof. Alyssa stood in the corner, watching it all. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just watched the empire crumble in real time. A reporter from CNN pushed through the crowd. "Mr. Dalton, how do you respond to these accusations of fraud?" Richard's security team tried to get him out of the room, but he was falling apart. Sweat dripped down his face. His perfect hair was messy. His $1,000 suit looked cheap under the harsh camera lights. "This is all a misunderstanding. That girl, she sabotaged me. She's trying to destroy me." Every camera turned to Alyssa. She looked directly into the lens, her voice calm and clear. "I gave him exactly what he asked for. The truth. What would you do if your boss humiliated you in front of the most powerful people in the city? Drop your answer below." As Richard's world burned around him, Alyssa picked up the fallen contract pages. She looked him in the eye and whispered for words that would haunt him forever. "I know everything, sir." 6 months earlier, Alyssa Carter stepped off a Greyhound bus in Times Square with $200 in her pocket and a dream that seemed impossible until she realized dreams weren't the currency that mattered in New York. The bus ride from Birmingham, Alabama had taken 18 hours. Her back ached from the cheap seats. Her stomach growled because she'd only eaten gas station sandwiches to save money. But when she saw those towering buildings reaching toward the sky like concrete mountains, something stirred in her chest. Hope, fear, determination all mixed together. New York smelled different than Birmingham. No magnolia trees or fresh-cut grass. Instead, it was exhaust fumes, hot dogs from street carts, and the sweat of 8 million people chasing their own versions of success. The noise hit her like a wall. Car horns, sirens, construction crews, people shouting in languages she didn't recognize. Alyssa had never felt so small. Back home in Birmingham, she'd been somebody. Straight-A student at Alabama State University. President of a business club. The girl who helped her mama organize church fundraisers and drove her daddy to dialysis appointments twice a week. She was the first person in her family to graduate college. Her parents had cried at commencement, proud tears streaming down faces weathered by decades of hard work. Her daddy drove a school bus for 32 years. Got up at 5 a.m. every morning, rain or shine. Her mama directed the church choir and cleaned houses on weekends to make ends meet. They'd sacrificed everything to give Alyssa opportunities they never had. "Baby girl," her mama had said the night before she left, "you got something special. Don't let nobody in that big city make you forget who you are." But standing in Times Square with tourists bumping into her and taxi drivers cursing at red lights, Alyssa wondered if special meant anything when you were invisible. She'd applied to 50 companies before graduation. Got rejection letters from 49 of them. The 50th was Dalton Enterprises. They offered her a secretary position with benefits and a salary that seemed like a fortune compared to what her parents made. The apartment she could afford was in Queens. 1 bedroom, no elevator, radiator that clanked like a ghost in chains. But it was hers. The first place she'd ever lived alone. She hung her business degree on the wall above her second-hand desk and promised herself this was just the beginning. Her first day at Dalton Enterprises, she wore her best dress. Navy blue, conservative, the kind her mama said showed respect. The building on Park Avenue made her dizzy just looking up at it. Glass and steel stretching 47 floors into the clouds. She'd never been inside anything so tall. The lobby was all marble and mirrors. Men in expensive suits talked loudly on phones about millions of dollars like they were discussing the weather. Women clicked across the floor in heels that cost more than Alyssa's rent. Everyone moved like they owned the world. She felt like a fraud. The elevator ride to the 45th floor made her ears pop. When the doors opened, she stepped into a different universe. The Dalton Enterprises office was bigger than her entire apartment building. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the city spread out below like a rich man's playground. That's when she first saw Richard Dalton. He was standing in the conference room, pointing at charts on the wall while three men in suits nodded along. Even through the glass, she could feel his presence. He commanded attention without trying. When he spoke, everyone leaned in. When he moved, everyone watched. Alyssa had never been attracted to older men, but there was something magnetic about Richard Dalton. Maybe it was the confidence. Maybe it was the way everyone treated him like royalty. Or maybe it was just that he represented everything she thought she wanted: power, respect, control over her own destiny. "You must be the new secretary." Alyssa spun around. A woman in her 50s stood behind her, perfectly dressed, perfectly polite, and perfectly cold. "I'm Margaret, Mr. Dalton's executive assistant. He likes his coffee black, his reports double-checked, and his schedule managed to the minute. You'll be handling his correspondence, filing, and whatever else needs doing. Have you ever felt completely out of place in a new environment? How did you adapt? Share your experience." The first week was torture. Everything was different. The computer system, the filing methods, the way meetings were scheduled. In Birmingham, people said please and thank you. Here, requests sounded like orders. Back home, mistakes were learning opportunities. Here, mistakes could get you fired. Richard Dalton barely noticed her at first. She was just another employee, part of the office furniture. When he needed something, he'd snap his fingers or bark orders without looking up from his phone. She was useful but invisible. But Alyssa was watching, learning. She noticed how Richard's mood changed depending on who was in the room. How he smiled differently for investors than he did for employees. How he saved his cruelest comments for people who couldn't fight back. She also noticed the fear in other employees' eyes when Richard walked by. The way conversations stopped when he entered a room. The way grown men and women became nervous children around him. On her third week, she made her first real mistake. She'd mixed up 2 appointments, and Richard had to wait 15 minutes for a client. 15 minutes that cost him thousands of dollars in delayed negotiations. He called her into his office that afternoon. The space was huge, with windows facing Central Park and furniture that probably cost more than her parents made in a year. "Mistakes like that are expensive, Alyssa." His voice was calm, which somehow made it more frightening. In this business, 15 minutes can mean the difference between success and failure. "I need to know you understand that." She nodded, throat tight with humiliation. "Good. Don't let it happen again." On her third day, she accidentally walked into Richard's office during a private call. What she heard about the Florida deal would change everything, if she was brave enough to remember it. She thought she was hired to answer phones and file papers. She had no idea she was being positioned as the perfect witness to a billionaire's crimes. 2 months into the job, Alyssa had found her rhythm. She arrived at 7:30 every morning, 30 minutes before anyone else. She liked the quiet office, the way sunlight streamed through empty windows, the sense that she was getting ahead while the rest of the world was still sleeping. Richard noticed. He started giving her more responsibilities, scheduling his meetings, reviewing his correspondence, organizing his files. Tasks that Margaret used to handle were slowly shifted to Alyssa's desk. "You're efficient," Richard told her one morning, handing her a stack of documents. "I appreciate efficiency." It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd gotten since starting work. Alyssa felt a warm glow of pride. Maybe she was finally proving herself. Maybe she belonged here after all. The documents Richard gave her were property assessments from Florida. Dozens of them. Shopping centers, apartment complexes, office buildings. All stamped with official seals and signed by certified appraisers. Her job was simple. Enter the property values into a spreadsheet, organize them by location, and file the hard copies. Boring work, but important. These numbers would be used in presentations to investors. That's when she noticed something strange. The property at 1247 Coral Springs Boulevard was listed at $12.3 million in one document and $3.1 million in another. Same property, same date, same appraiser, but the values were completely different. At first, she thought it was a typo. Real estate was complicated. Maybe there were different evaluation methods or market fluctuations she didn't understand. She flagged it for Margaret to review. But then she found another discrepancy, and another. By the end of the week, she discovered over 30 properties with wildly different valuations. "Margaret," she said, showing her the files, "I think there might be some mistakes in these assessments." Margaret barely looked at the documents. "File them as they are. Mr. Dalton knows what he's doing." Something in Margaret's tone made Alyssa pause. It wasn't dismissive. It was nervous, like she was scared to even discuss the numbers. Alyssa went back to her desk, but she couldn't focus. The numbers didn't make sense. You couldn't have the same building worth $12 million one day and $3 million the next unless something catastrophic had happened. Natural disaster, economic collapse, major structural damage. But these properties were all fine. She'd seen the photos. Modern buildings in good condition. So why the different numbers? That night, she stayed late to finish entering data. The office was empty except for the cleaning crew. Through Richard's glass walls, she could see him on a conference call, gesturing at charts on his computer screen. His voice carried through the thin walls. "The Miami properties are gold mines," he was saying to someone on speakerphone. "Waterfront locations, prime real estate. We're talking about 400% returns in the first 2 years alone." Alyssa's fingers froze over her keyboard. 400% returns? But the lower valuations she'd been filing showed those same properties were barely worth their mortgages. "The environmental reports came back clean," Richard continued. "No contamination, no flood risks, no restrictions on development." Environmental reports? Alyssa hadn't seen any environmental reports in the files she'd been organizing. She glanced around the empty office. Everyone had gone home hours ago. The cleaning crew was on the lower floors. Richard's door was closed, his attention focused on the call. Quietly, she opened the filing cabinet next to her desk. The one labeled Florida Projects Confidential. Margaret had given her the key but told her she only needed to file documents, not read them. Inside were hundreds of pages she'd never seen before. Environmental impact studies, soil contamination reports, flood zone assessments, documents that painted a very different picture of Richard's Florida empire. The Coral Springs property wasn't worth $12 million. It was built on contaminated soil. The cleanup costs alone would eat up any profits for decades. The Miami waterfront properties weren't gold mines. They were in flood zones that would be underwater within 20 years due to rising sea levels. The shopping centers weren't prime real estate. They were built on protected wetlands using permits that had been obtained through bribes to local officials. Alyssa felt sick. These weren't just accounting errors. This was fraud. Richard was lying to investors about the true value of his properties. He was selling them buildings that were worthless or even liabilities while hiding the real problems behind fake assessments. Her hands shook as she photographed the documents with her phone. She didn't know what she was going to do with the evidence, but she knew she needed to preserve it. Have you ever discovered something you weren't supposed to know? What did you do with that information? The sound of Richard's door opening made her jump. She quickly closed the filing cabinet and pretended to work on her computer. "Still here, Alyssa?" Richard's voice made her heart race. Dedicated. I like that. He walked over to her desk, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne, close enough to see the documents on her screen if he wanted to. "The Florida project is important to me," he said casually. I hope I can count on your discretion. It wasn't a question. It was a warning. Of course, sir. I just enter the numbers you give me. Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Exactly. You enter the numbers I give you. Nothing more, nothing less. After he left, Alyssa sat in the empty office, her heart pounding. She thought about her parents back in Birmingham. Her daddy's pride when she got the job. Her mama's hopes for her future. They'd sacrificed everything to give her opportunities. But what kind of opportunity was this? To be part of a fraud that would destroy the retirement savings of teachers and firefighters? To help a billionaire steal from people who could barely afford to invest in the first place? The next morning, Margaret pulled her aside with trembling hands. "Listen to me carefully," the older woman whispered. "Don't ask questions about the files. Don't dig into the numbers. Don't try to understand what you're not supposed to understand. Why? What happened to the last secretary?" Margaret's face went white. She asked too many questions. She thought she could fix things. Make them right. What happened to her? The senior accountant pulled her aside with trembling hands. "Don't dig too deep, honey. The last girl who asked questions, well, let's just say she's not asking anymore. Every empire has a weak foundation. Richard Dalton's was built on Florida swampland and lies that were about to surface. The name was Sarah Mitchell, 24 years old, business degree from Emory University. She'd worked as Richard's secretary for 8 months before Alyssa. According to the company records, Sarah had resigned to pursue other opportunities. But the security guard who worked nights had a different story. She didn't resign, he told Alyssa during one of their brief conversations by the elevator. She was escorted out by 2 men in dark suits. Never came back for her personal things. Never said goodbye to anyone. Alyssa's blood ran cold. What kind of men? The kind you don't ask questions about. That night, Alyssa couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Sarah Mitchell, about the trembling in Margaret's hands, about the way Richard's smile never reached his eyes when he talked about discretion. She started researching the Florida properties on her own time, using her laptop at home in Queens. Public records were available online if you knew where to look. What she found made her stomach turn. The Coral Springs Shopping Center was built on land that had been a chemical plant in the 1980s. The soil contamination was so bad that the EPA had classified it as a Superfund site. Cleanup would cost $50 million minimum. But Richard's documents showed it as prime retail space worth $30 million. The Miami waterfront condos were even worse. The land was sinking at a rate of 2 inches per year. The buildings would be uninhabitable within a decade. But Richard was selling shares to retirement funds and pension plans, telling them it was a guaranteed investment. The worst part was the people getting hurt, not other billionaires or corporations that could absorb losses. Teachers' pension funds, firefighters' retirement accounts, working families who'd saved every penny for their futures. Richard wasn't just committing fraud. He was stealing the dreams of people who reminded her of her own parents. The next week, Richard asked her to stay late to prepare for a presentation to a group of institutional investors. Pension funds from 3 states were considering putting $500 million into his Florida projects. "I need you to prepare the investor packets," he said, handing her a list. "Use the updated property assessments, the ones from last month." Alyssa knew which assessments he meant. The fake ones that inflated values by 300%. The ones that hid the environmental problems and structural issues. "Sir, should I include the environmental reports?" Richard's eyes went cold. "What environmental reports?" "The ones in the confidential files. The EPA assessments, the soil contamination studies." The office went dead quiet. Richard stood slowly from his chair, his face darkening like storm clouds. "Alyssa, let me be very clear about something. You're a secretary. Your job is to do what you're told, not to think about what you're doing. The investors will receive exactly the information I want them to receive." His voice was soft, but there was steel underneath. The kind of steel that had cut through Sarah Mitchell's career and possibly her safety. "Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." But she didn't just understand. She was learning. Richard Dalton didn't just commit fraud for money. He enjoyed it. The power of deceiving people who trusted him. The thrill of getting away with something that would destroy anyone else. That night, She made a decision that would change everything. She started making copies of everything. Environmental reports, real property assessments, communications between Richard and his co-conspirators in Florida. Every document that showed the true scope of his crimes. She used the office copy machine during lunch breaks when everyone was gone. She photographed files with her phone when Margaret was in meetings. She even recorded some of Richard's phone calls using a voice memo app. It was dangerous. If Richard found out, she'd end up like Sarah Mitchell. But she couldn't stand by and watch him steal from people who worked as hard as her parents did. The break she'd been waiting for came 3 weeks later. Richard was on a call with someone in Miami. A city official named Carlos Rodriguez who'd been taking bribes to approve building permits in protected areas. The wetlands inspector is asking too many questions, Rodriguez said through the speakerphone. He wants to see the actual construction sites. Then make sure he sees the right sites, Richard replied calmly. The ones we prepared for inspection, not the ones where we're actually building. That's going to cost extra. How much extra? $50,000. Cash. Richard laughed. Done. But Carlos, make sure this inspector understands what happens to people who don't cooperate. We wouldn't want him to have an accident. The threat was clear. Anyone who exposed Richard's crimes would face more than just job loss. When was the last time someone's simple touch left you breathless? Share your story in the comments. Alyssa's hands shook as she saved the recording. This wasn't just fraud anymore. Richard was bribing officials and threatening anyone who got his way. She thought about calling the FBI, but she was just a secretary from Birmingham. Who would believe her word against the billionaires? She needed more evidence, better evidence. Something so clear that even Richard's expensive lawyers couldn't explain it away. The USB drive felt heavy in her purse as she walked past Richard's office. Inside, he was laughing with investors about environmental idiots who don't understand progress. She realized then that some men don't deserve mercy. The one person who could have saved Richard Dalton tried to warn him 3 times. He was too arrogant to listen. Marcus Webb walked into Dalton Enterprises on a Tuesday morning in October like he owned the place, which technically he used to. 20 years ago, Marcus and Richard had been partners. They'd built their first real estate empire together, turning abandoned warehouses in Brooklyn into luxury condos. But Marcus had gotten out of the partnership when Richard's methods became too aggressive, too willing to bend rules, too comfortable with hurting people for profit. Now Marcus ran his own investment firm, focusing on sustainable development and ethical business practices. He was everything Richard could have been if greed hadn't rotted his soul. Alyssa watched from her desk as the 2 men embraced in Richard's office. Through the glass walls, she could see them laughing and reminiscing like old friends. But there was tension underneath. Marcus kept glancing at the Florida project charts on Richard's walls. Alyssa, Richard called out, bring us some coffee. The good stuff from my private stash. As she prepared the coffee, she could hear fragments of their conversation. The numbers look impressive, Richard, but I'm concerned about the environmental impact assessments. Everything's been handled properly. You know I don't cut corners on legal compliance. Marcus's laugh was bitter. Since when? Remember the Queens project in '97? The one that got us sued for $20 million because you forgot to mention the asbestos. Alyssa's hands stilled on the coffee cups. Richard had done this before. The Florida fraud wasn't his first time destroying people's lives for profit. When she brought the coffee into the office, Marcus smiled at her warmly. You must be Alyssa. Richard's told me how valuable you are to his operation. Something in his tone made her look up. Marcus's eyes were kind but sharp, like he was seeing more than Richard realized. Thank you, sir. If you need anything else, just let me know. As she turned to leave, Marcus spoke again. Alyssa, you remind me of my daughter. She's about your age, working in finance down in Atlanta. I always tell her the most important thing in business isn't making money. It's being able to look at yourself in the mirror every morning. The words hit her like a physical blow. Marcus knew. Somehow, he understood exactly what kind of position she was in. Over the next 2 hours, she listened to Marcus try to save his former partner's soul. Richard, I've been looking at your Florida investments. The returns you're promising, they're not realistic unless you're hiding major costs. Marcus, you always were too conservative. That's why I'm worth 3 times what you are. Money isn't worth anything if you go to prison for fraud. The word hung in the air like poison gas. Through the glass, Alyssa saw Richard's face turn red. Are you accusing me of something? I'm warning you. The SEC is asking questions. Environmental groups are filing lawsuits. Sooner or later, someone's going to dig deep enough to find the truth. Let them dig. I've got the best lawyers money can buy. Marcus shook his head sadly. You can't lawyer your way out of everything, Richard. And you can't intimidate everyone who threatens you. What's that supposed to mean? It means I know what happened to Sarah Mitchell. The office went dead silent. Even from her desk, Alyssa could feel the tension crackling like electricity. Richard's voice was ice cold. Sarah resigned. She found better opportunities. Sarah's in witness protection, Richard. She talked to the FBI before she disappeared. The only reason you're not in handcuffs right now is because they're building a case that will stick. Alyssa's blood turned to ice water. Sarah Mitchell was alive. She was in witness protection because she tried to expose Richard's crimes. That's why she disappeared so suddenly. That's why she'd never come back for her things. You're lying, Richard snarled. I'm trying to save you. There's still time to come clean. Make restitution. Cooperate with the investigation. You might avoid prison if you help them recover the stolen money. Richard laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass. I'm not admitting to anything because I haven't done anything wrong. And if you're smart, Marcus, you'll forget whatever lies people have been telling you. Marcus stood up, his face filled with disappointment. 20 years of friendship, and this is what you've become. A bully who threatens people for trying to help him. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm just suggesting that some conversations are better forgotten. Marcus turned to leave, then paused at the door. Richard, I'm going to give you one last chance. Clean up the Florida mess. Pay back the investors. Do the right thing. Or what? Or I'll make sure the right people know exactly what you're doing to those pension funds. Have you ever tried to save someone from their own destructive choices? Did they listen? Tell me your story. After Marcus left, Richard sat in his office for an hour, staring out the window at the city below. When he finally called Alyssa in, his voice was different. Harder. I want you to pull all the files on the Florida projects. Every environmental report, every assessment, every communication with local officials. Box them up and take them to the shredding company downtown. All of them, sir. Every single page. I want those documents to disappear completely. But it was too late. Alyssa had already copied everything. Richard's empire was built on lies, and she was the only one positioned to bring it all crashing down. Marcus slipped the business card into Alyssa's hand. When this all comes crashing down, and it will, call me. You'll need someone who believes in doing the right thing. She had no idea how soon she'd need that number. There's a moment in every toxic relationship when the victim realizes they have more power than their abuser ever imagined. For Alyssa Carter, that moment came with a coffee stain and a screaming match that would echo through Manhattan's most elite boardrooms. The Tuesday morning started like any other nightmare. Richard Dalton stormed into the office at 6 a.m., his jaw tight with the kind of rage that made seasoned executives cross themselves and pray for mercy. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor like a countdown timer to someone's destruction. Carter, his voice cut through the morning quiet like a blade. Conference room. Now, Alyssa had learned to read the weather patterns of his moods. Today felt like a Category 5 hurricane, and she was standing right in its path. She grabbed her notepad and followed him into the glass-walled conference room, where deals worth billions had been born and died. The Henderson files, he snapped, not bothering to look at her. Where are they? She had prepared for this moment. The Henderson files contained the real numbers from the Florida project, numbers that painted a very different picture from the ones Richard had been showing investors. She had placed them exactly where they belonged. In the hands of people who knew how to read between the lies. They're in the Henderson folders, sir. Third cabinet, second drawer. His eyes narrowed. Something in her tone had shifted. After 6 months of watching her shrink under his verbal attacks, her voice now carried something he hadn't heard before. Confidence. Don't play games with me, Carter. I need those files for the Morrison meeting in 20 minutes. James Morrison. The name sent electricity through her chest. The young lawyer who had been quietly building a case against Richard's empire, one document at a time. The man whose gentle hands had shown her what respect felt like after months of psychological warfare. "I'll get them right away, sir." She walked to the cabinet, her heels steady on the polished floor. Behind her, Richard paced like a caged predator, his phone pressed to his ear as he barked orders at some unfortunate soul on the other end. The files weren't there. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained calm. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment when Richard Dalton would reveal exactly who he was in front of the people who mattered most. "Well," his voice could have frozen hell. "I'm looking, sir." "You're looking?" He ended his phone call with a vicious stab at the screen. "You're looking? I don't pay you to look, you worthless." The conference room door opened. James Morrison stepped inside, his kind eyes taking in the scene with the precision of a man who had seen this movie too many times before. Behind him walked three other investors, their expensive suits and calculating gazes turning the room into a theater. Perfect timing. Richard's face flushed red. He grabbed the coffee cup from Alyssa's hands and hurled it against the wall. Brown liquid splattered across the pristine white paint like blood at a crime scene. 6 months, he roared, his spit flying across her face. 6 months, I've wasted training you, and you can't handle a simple filing system. My grandmother could do your job better, and she's been dead for 10 years. The room went silent. James's jaw clenched, but Alyssa caught his eye and gave the slightest shake of her head. "Not yet. You know what your problem is, Carter?" Richard stepped closer, his breath hot against her face. "You're weak. You're pathetic. You come from nothing, and that's exactly what you'll always be. A nobody from Alabama who thinks she can play in the big leagues." "Birmingham," she corrected softly. "What? I'm from Birmingham, not Alabama in general. Birmingham specifically." Her voice was steady as stone. "And you're right about one thing, Mr. Dalton. I did come from nothing, but that taught me something you never learned." The investors leaned forward. James pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the record button. "And what's that?" Richard's voice dripped with contempt. "The value of truth." She walked to her purse, which sat on the side table like an innocent leather bomb. From inside, she pulled out a manila folder thick enough to choke on. "The Henderson files, sir. All of them, including the environmental impact reports you buried, the falsified property valuations, the bribes to county officials, the wetlands you destroyed in the name of progress." She placed the folder on the conference table with the gentleness of someone laying flowers on a grave. "Everything." The color drained from Richard's face like water from a broken dam. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alyssa addressed the investors directly, her voice clear and strong. "You came here today to discuss a partnership with Dalton Enterprises. I think you deserve to know exactly what kind of business you'd be investing in." Richard lunged forward, his hand reaching for the folder, but James stepped between them. The young lawyer's usually gentle demeanor had transformed into something fierce and protective. "Don't," James said quietly. "Don't make this worse than it already is." Richard's eyes darted between the faces surrounding him. The investors wore expressions of disgust and calculation, the look of people who had just realized they were about to dodge a very expensive bullet. "You!" Richard's voice shook with rage and something else, something that looked almost like heartbreak. "You have no idea what you've just done." Alyssa straightened her shoulders and looked him directly in the eye. For the first time in 6 months, she wasn't afraid. "I know exactly what I've done, sir. I've told the truth. Something you might want to try sometime." As the investors filed out, their whispered conversations already sealing Richard's fate, she began cleaning coffee from the white wall. The stain would never fully come out, but that seemed fitting somehow. Behind her, she could hear Richard's empire beginning to crumble, one canceled meeting at a time. The sound was beautiful. The most dangerous enemies are the ones who smile at your victories while secretly documenting your failures. Richard Dalton was about to learn this lesson from his own employees. 3 days after the coffee incident, Alyssa discovered she wasn't alone in her war against the tyrant of the 32nd floor. The first sign came from Patricia Williams, the bookkeeper whose hands had been shaking for months every time Richard walked past her desk. "Honey," Patricia whispered during lunch break, glancing around the employee break room like a spy in enemy territory. "Can we talk? Somewhere private." They met at a coffee shop 6 blocks from the office, far enough away that no one from Dalton Enterprises would accidentally overhear their conversation. Patricia clutched her purse like a life preserver, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the storm brewing behind her eyes. "I saw what you did in that conference room," she began, her voice barely audible over the espresso machine's angry hissing. "With those files." Alyssa's stomach clenched. Had she misjudged Patricia? Was this a trap? "I don't know what you mean." Patricia smiled. The first genuine smile Alyssa had seen from her in months. "Sweetheart, I've been cooking books longer than you've been breathing. I know exactly what you mean." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And I want to help." The floodgates opened. Over the next 2 hours, Patricia revealed a network of employees who had been silently documenting Richard's crimes for years. There was David Chun from IT, who had been quietly backing up deleted emails to an external server. Margaret Foster from Human Resources, who had kept detailed records of every harassment complaint that Richard had buried. Even Tony Rodriguez from Maintenance, who had photographed documents that executives threw away, thinking the cleaning crew couldn't read. "We've been waiting," Patricia explained, stirring her coffee with the mechanical precision of someone who had been planning this moment for years. Waiting for someone with access to the executive files. Someone brave enough to actually use them. "Why didn't you act before now?" Patricia's laugh held no humor. "Because we're expendable. Honey, you think anyone would have listened to the bookkeeper, the IT guy, and the janitor? But you." She studied Alyssa's face with the intensity of someone reading tea leaves. "You've got something we don't have." "What's that?" "His attention. For better or worse, Richard Dalton pays attention to you. That makes you dangerous in ways he doesn't understand yet." That evening, Alyssa met the full group in David Chin's cramped apartment in Queens. The living room felt like a war room, with laptops glowing on every surface and document spread across the coffee table like pieces of a massive puzzle. David, barely 30, but already going gray from stress, pulled up email after email on his computer screen. He thinks he's smart, deleting everything after board meetings. "But I've been saving copies to a secure server for 2 years." Margaret, a woman whose kind grandmother appearance masked a mind sharp as broken glass, opened a file cabinet that contained more ammunition than a military armory. Sexual harassment complaints going back 5 years. All buried, all ignored. The women were either paid off or fired. She looked directly at Alyssa. "You're not his first secretary, dear. You're just the first one who didn't run away." "What happened to the others?" 3 quit after he propositioned them. 2 were fired for performance issues after rejecting him. 1. Margaret's voice trailed off. 1 took a settlement and signed papers promising never to speak about what happened here. The room fell silent. Tony Rodriguez, a man whose calloused hands told stories of honest work in a dishonest world, spoke up from the corner where he'd been quietly sorting through photographs. "My daughter starts college next year," he said, his accent thick with emotion. "You know what I told her when she asked me what kind of man I work for? I told her that sometimes good people have to work for bad people, but that doesn't make us bad people too." He held up a photograph of a shredded document he'd painstakingly pieced back together. "But maybe it's time to stop working for bad people altogether." James Morrison arrived at 9 o'clock, carrying pizza and legal papers that would make Richard Dalton wish he'd never heard the name Alyssa Carter. The young lawyer's presence transformed the informal gathering into something more serious, a formal alliance with teeth. "What you've assembled here," James said, reviewing the evidence spread across every surface, "is enough to put him away for 20 years. Environmental crimes, fraud, bribery, sexual harassment, tax evasion. It's like a masterclass in corporate corruption." "But will it stick?" Alyssa asked. James met her eyes, and she felt that familiar flutter of attraction mixed with something deeper. Respect, admiration, and the intoxicating possibility of partnership between equals. "With your testimony as the centerpiece, it'll stick like superglue." Patricia raised her coffee cup like a toast. To the secretary who brought down the empire. I haven't brought down anything yet, Alyssa protested. David grinned, his fingers flying across his keyboard. Actually, you have. The Environmental Protection Agency called this afternoon. Apparently, they received an anonymous package containing very interesting information about certain Florida properties. Margaret chuckled, and the state attorney general's office got a similar package about harassment claims. Tony winked. The IRS might have gotten something too. Can't remember exactly what. Alyssa stared at these people. These beautiful, brave, ordinary people who had decided that enough was enough. Her throat tightened with an emotion she couldn't name. Why? She whispered. Why risk everything for me? James reached over and squeezed her hand. We're not doing this for you, Alyssa. We're doing this with you. There's a difference. Outside David's apartment window, the city sparkled like a constellation of possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time in months, Alyssa Carter felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The war was just beginning, and she finally had an army. Richard Dalton taught Alyssa Carter everything she needed to know about power. Unfortunately for him, she was a much better student than he was a teacher. The education began in James Morrison's cramped law office, where towers of legal books created a maze of knowledge that would become Alyssa's new classroom. For 2 weeks, she spent every evening after work learning the language that would destroy her tormentor: securities fraud, environmental law, whistleblower protections, and civil rights violations. Power isn't about screaming the loudest, James explained, his finger tracing a line of legal text that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics 6 months ago. Now, Alyssa could read it like poetry. It's about knowing exactly what weapons you have and when to use them. She learned that Richard's empire wasn't built on genius or innovation. It was built on a foundation of legal loopholes and moral shortcuts that could be exposed by anyone smart enough to know where to look. And after 6 months of filing his papers, organizing his meetings, and listening to his phone calls, she knew exactly where to look. The beauty of the Florida deal, she said, spreading the environmental impact reports across James's desk like a winning poker hand, isn't just that he falsified the documents. It's that he was so arrogant. He kept the real documents too, filed right next to the fake ones like some kind of twisted insurance policy. James shook his head in amazement. He really thought no one would ever challenge him. He thought no one would ever dare. But the most important part of her education wasn't happening in law books or evidence files. It was happening in the quiet moments between study sessions, when James would look at her with an expression that made her chest tighten in the most wonderful way. You know, he said one evening, closing the case file and leaning back in his chair, 6 months ago, if someone had told me that Richard Dalton's secretary would become his most dangerous enemy, I would have laughed. And now I think you're the most formidable person I've ever met. The word formidable sent electricity through her veins. Richard had called her weak, pathetic, worthless. James saw strength where her former boss saw servitude. Their first kiss happened over a stack of financial documents that proved Richard had been stealing from his own investors. It was gentle, respectful, and absolutely nothing like the aggressive attention she'd learned to fear from powerful men. Is this appropriate? She whispered against his lips. I mean, professionally? Probably not, he admitted, his forehead resting against hers. But since when has doing the right thing been about following all the rules? Meanwhile, Richard remained blissfully unaware that his secretary had transformed from victim to prosecutor. He continued his pattern of daily humiliation, seemingly addicted to the rush of making someone smaller than himself feel even smaller. Carter, coffee. Now, and try not to spill it this time. I know coordination isn't your strong suit. She brought him his coffee with a smile that he misread as submission. If he had looked closer, he might have noticed the quiet confidence in her posture, the steady way she met his eyes, the fact that his insults no longer made her flinch. Will there be anything else, sir? Try to look professional today. We have important clients coming in, and I need my staff to at least pretend they belong here. Of course, sir. I'll do my best to represent the company well. He missed the subtle emphasis on represent. She wasn't just his secretary anymore. She was the company's conscience, preparing to speak for everyone he had silenced over the years. The $3.5 billion deal presentation was scheduled for Friday evening. A celebration dinner, Richard called it, where Manhattan's most elite investors would toast the expansion of his empire into Florida's environmental disaster zone. "This is it," Patricia whispered during their final planning meeting. "After Friday, there's no going back." "I know," Alyssa replied, her voice steady as bedrock. "I'm ready." David had prepared a digital presentation that would display the real environmental damage alongside Richard's doctor reports. Margaret had compiled testimonies from every woman Richard had harassed or assaulted. Tony had photographs of documents that proved the bribery allegations. But the centerpiece would be Alyssa herself, standing up in front of the most powerful people in New York City and speaking truth to power with a voice that had been strengthened by months of abuse and weeks of preparation. "He's going to try to destroy you," James warned, his hand gentle on her cheek. "Publicly. Brutally. Are you prepared for that?" She thought of the girl who had stepped off the Greyhound bus 6 months ago, terrified and overwhelmed by the city's indifference. That girl had been looking for someone to save her. The woman she had become was ready to save herself, and everyone else Richard had hurt. "Let him try," she said. "The louder he screams, the more evidence we'll have of exactly who he is." Thursday night, she sat in her small apartment, looking out at the Manhattan skyline that had once seemed so impossible to conquer. Tomorrow, she would walk into that ballroom not as Richard Dalton's secretary, but as the architect of his downfall. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm proud of you. You've already won." She smiled and typed back, "The war isn't over yet." But as she looked at her reflection in the darkened window, at the strong woman who had emerged from 6 months of corporate warfare, she realized that James was right. She had already won. Tomorrow was just the victory celebration. The most perfect traps are the ones where the victim walks in willingly, convinced they're walking toward triumph. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made Manhattan feel electric with possibility. Richard Dalton strutted into the office like a man who owned the world, which, in his mind, he practically did. The $3.5 billion Florida deal would make him one of the most powerful real estate developers on the East Coast. He had no idea he was walking into his own execution. "Carter," his voice boomed across the office with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences. "Conference room. We need to go over the final presentation details." Alyssa gathered her notebooks, her heart beating steady and strong. After weeks of preparation, she felt like a surgeon approaching the operating table, calm, focused, and absolutely certain of what needed to be done. The presentation materials were spread across the conference table like a magician's props before the final act. Charts showing projected profits, environmental impact assessments that painted Florida's wetlands as expendable wasteland, and financial projections that would make investors salivate with greed. All of it lies. All of it poison wrapped in glossy presentations and executive confidence. "This is it, Carter," Richard said, his eyes gleaming with the kind of manic energy that had built his empire on other people's suffering. "After tonight, Dalton Enterprises becomes Dalton Dynasty. We're not just building developments, we're building a legacy. It's certainly going to be memorable, sir." Something in her tone made him look at her more closely. For 6 months, she had perfected the art of invisibility, becoming the kind of secretary who could be in the room without being noticed. But today, something was different. She held herself straighter, spoke with quiet confidence, and met his eyes without the usual flash of fear. "You seem different today," he observed, his predator's instincts finally waking up. "More confident. I've learned a lot working for you, Mr. Dalton. About business, about power, about what kind of person I want to be." He smiled, completely misunderstanding her words. "Good. Maybe you're finally growing into the position. Tonight's going to be big, Carter. The biggest night of my career. I need you sharp." "I'll be ready, sir. More ready than you know." By 5 p.m., the ballroom at the Meridian Hotel had been transformed into a temple of corporate worship. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across round tables where Manhattan's elite would soon gather to celebrate environmental destruction disguised as progress. The presentation screen dominated one wall, ready to display Richard's version of the truth. Alyssa arrived early, ostensibly to handle last-minute details, but actually to make final preparations for the most important performance of her life. Her black dress was elegant but professional. She wanted to look credible when she destroyed Richard's world, not like she was attending a funeral, though in many ways, that's exactly what this was. James appeared at her elbow, handsome in his dark suit, but tense with the weight of what was coming. "Last chance to change your mind," he murmured, his hand brushing hers in a gesture of support. "Once this starts, there's no stopping it." "I don't want to stop it." She turned to face him, letting him see the steel in her eyes. He made his choices. Tonight, he faces the consequences. And after tonight, she smiled, the expression transforming her face from pretty to radiant. After tonight, we see what the world looks like when good people refuse to stay quiet. Patricia, David, Margaret, and Tony had positioned themselves throughout the ballroom like sleeper agents waiting for activation. Patricia managed the guest registry, ensuring that every investor, reporter, and city official on their target list received proper welcome packets, including supplementary materials that Richard hadn't approved. David handled the audiovisual setup, with backup presentations ready to display at a moment's notice. Margaret and Tony worked the room like seasoned socialites, engaging investors in conversations about corporate responsibility and environmental protection. The trap was set with military precision. At 7 p.m., Richard made his grand entrance, wearing the kind of smile that had charmed investors out of billions and intimidated employees into silence. He worked the room like a politician, shaking hands and making promises he had no intention of keeping. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, tapping his champagne glass with a fork, "welcome to the future of American development. Tonight, we're not just celebrating a business deal. We're celebrating the triumph of vision over regulation, progress over environmental hysteria, and profit over political correctness." Polite applause rippled through the room, but Alyssa noticed several investors exchanging glances. The supplementary materials were having their intended effect. But first, Richard continued, his voice rising with theatrical flair. "I want to thank the woman who made tonight possible. My secretary, Alyssa Carter, has been invaluable in organizing this presentation." "Stand up, Carter. Take a bow." This wasn't part of the plan. Alyssa felt every eye in the room turn toward her, the weight of attention like a physical force. Richard's smile held an edge of cruelty. He was setting her up for humiliation, one final demonstration of his power before his moment of triumph. She stood slowly, gracefully, meeting his eyes across the crowded room. In that moment, she realized that he had just given her the perfect opening. "Thank you, Mr. Dalton," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. "It's been an education working for you. Tonight, I'd like to share some of what I've learned." His smile faltered slightly, confusion flickering across his features. "Indeed you will, Carter. Indeed you will." The trap was about to spring, and the predator had just walked willingly into the killing field. 7:45 p.m. The moment Richard Dalton's empire began to crumble wasn't when the investors walked away. It was when he opened his mouth and revealed exactly who he really was. The ballroom hummed with the kind of energy that accompanies great moments in history. Champagne flutes caught the light like tiny stars, and conversation buzzed with the electric anticipation of money about to be made. Richard Dalton stood at the podium like a king addressing his court, completely unaware that his subjects had already chosen a new ruler. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had never been told no, "tonight we make history. The Florida Wetland Development Project represents more than just profit. It represents the American spirit of conquest over nature, progress over preservation, and vision over the small-minded environmental extremism that has held back development for too long." Polite applause, but several investors shifted uncomfortably. The supplementary materials Patricia had slipped into their welcome packets were working like slow-acting poison, raising questions that Richard's presentation would struggle to answer. Alyssa stood near the back of the room, her heart beating steady and strong. James caught her eye from across the ballroom and gave her the slightest nod. David's fingers hovered over his laptop, ready to switch presentations at a moment's notice. Margaret and Tony flanked the room's exits, ensuring that no one would leave before the truth came out. But before we discuss the financial projections, Richard continued, clicking to his first slide. I want to address some concerns that have been raised about environmental impact. Now, I know there are people in this room who worry about every frog and butterfly, but I'm here to tell you that progress requires sacrifice. The slide showed pristine Florida coastline, but several investors had already seen the supplementary photos. The same coastline after Richard's previous developments had turned it into a toxic wasteland. Of course, Richard said, his smile taking on a nasty edge. Not everyone understands the vision required for true success. Some people are content to remain small, to think small, to achieve small results. They lack the killer instinct that separates winners from losers. His eyes found Alyssa in the crowd, and his smile became predatory. Take my secretary, for example. Miss Carter came to me from some backwater town in Alabama, thinking she could play in the big leagues. But the truth is, some people are born to serve, not to lead. Some people are destined to take orders, not give them. A murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't the kind of speech that inspired investor confidence. It was the rambling of a man drunk on his own power. James stepped forward, his phone already recording, but Alyssa held up her hand. Not yet. Miss Carter represents everything that's wrong with the participation trophy generation, Richard continued, his voice growing louder and more vicious with each word. They think showing up is enough. They think being pleasant and polite entitles them to respect they haven't earned. But the truth is, mediocrity deserves nothing but contempt. The room had gone completely silent. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, a powerful man destroying himself in real time. So let me be clear, Richard said, pointing directly at Alyssa, his voice rising to a shout that echoed off the ballroom's crystal chandeliers. When I see someone like Miss Carter, someone who contributes nothing, achieves nothing, and expects everything, it makes me sick. People like her are why America is falling behind. Weak, pathetic, worthless. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Alyssa began to clap. Slowly, deliberately, her applause echoing through the stunned ballroom like gunshots. "Bravo, Mr. Dalton," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. That was exactly what these investors needed to hear. She walked toward the front of the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the rhythm of a countdown timer. Richard's face flushed red as he realized that something had gone horribly wrong. "You see, ladies and gentlemen," Alyssa continued, addressing the crowd with the confidence of someone who held all the cards, Mr. Dalton just demonstrated something very important about his character. His judgment, his fitness to manage other people's money. She reached the podium and held out her hand. "May I?" Richard stared at her, confusion and rage warring across his features. "What are you doing?" "My job, sir. My job is to serve this company's best interests, and right now, that means telling these investors the truth." David clicked a button, and the presentation screen changed. Instead of Richard's doctored environmental reports, the real photos appeared. Miles of dead fish floating in poison water, wetlands reduced to toxic mud, and local communities whose drinking water had been contaminated by previous Dalton developments. The Florida project, Alyssa announced, her voice steady as stone, has been built on falsified environmental impact reports, bribed county officials, and property valuations that inflate actual worth by approximately 300%. The real environmental damage, which Mr. Dalton has worked so hard to hide, would make this development illegal under both state and federal law. Richard lunged toward the podium, but James and two security guards blocked his path. "You can't do this," he screamed, his face purple with rage. "You're nothing. You're nobody." "You're right," Alyssa replied calmly, clicking to the next slide. Financial documents showing the bribes, the cover-ups, and the systematic fraud that had built Richard's empire. I'm nobody, just a secretary from Birmingham who happened to pay attention to the papers she was filing. The investors were already standing, their faces grim with the realization that they had almost walked into a financial disaster. Phones appeared throughout the room as reporters began live-streaming the corporate meltdown that would dominate tomorrow's news cycle. This is what I learned working for Richard Dalton, Alyssa continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I learned that power without conscience is just sophisticated bullying. I learned that cruelty isn't strength. It's weakness disguised as authority. And I learned that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the only one brave enough to speak the truth. Richard made one final desperate lunge toward the podium, but security was already escorting him toward the exit. As he passed Alyssa, he stopped and grabbed her arm, his eyes wild with desperate rage. "This isn't over," he hissed, his grip tight enough to bruise. "You have no idea what you've just done to yourself." Alyssa looked at him with something approaching pity. "I know exactly what I've done, sir. I've told the truth. Something you should have tried 6 months ago." As security pulled him away, Richard's voice echoed through the ballroom one final time. "You'll never work in this city again. I'll destroy you." The ballroom erupted in whispers and frantic phone calls as investors began the damage control that would save them from association with Richard's collapsing empire. Reporters swarmed toward Alyssa, their questions overlapping in a cascade of media attention that would transform her from anonymous secretary to corporate whistleblower overnight. But she only had eyes for James, who pushed through the crowd with an expression of pure admiration and something deeper. Something that looked like love. "Are you okay?" he asked, his hands gentle on her shoulders. She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I'm perfect. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be." Outside the ballroom windows, Manhattan glittered like a constellation of possibilities. The empire had fallen, but the real victory was just beginning. Revenge is a dish best served cold, but justice? Justice burns hot and bright and impossible to extinguish. The morning after Richard Dalton's public destruction, Alyssa woke to find her small apartment surrounded by news vans like sharks circling wounded prey. Her phone had been buzzing since 3 a.m. with calls from reporters, lawyers, and talk show producers who all wanted the same thing: an exclusive interview with the secretary who brought down a billion-dollar empire. She ignored them all and made coffee instead. The kitchen window overlooked a narrow alley where she could see photographers with telephoto lenses aimed at her building like snipers. Fame, she decided, was highly overrated. She had spoken her truth, exposed the corruption, and protected future victims from Richard's cruelty. The media circus was just noise. But the noise got louder when James called at 7 a.m., his voice tight with excitement and concern. "Alyssa, have you seen the news? I'm avoiding it." She cradled the phone between her shoulder and ear while buttering toast. "How bad is it?" "It's not bad, it's huge. Every major network is running your story. Secretary exposes corporate fraud is trending on social media. The FBI is opening an investigation. The Environmental Protection Agency is calling it the biggest fraud case in a decade." Through her kitchen window, she watched a news reporter practicing her opening lines. "Behind me is the modest apartment where corporate whistleblower Alyssa Carter." The woman's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "James, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Always. Are you proud of what we did, or are you worried about what comes next?" His laugh was warm and immediate. "Proud doesn't begin to cover it. You stood up to a monster who had been terrorizing people for years. You protected investors from losing billions. You probably saved that Florida wetland from destruction. Why would I be worried? Because monsters don't go quietly into the night." As if summoned by her words, her doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw 2 FBI agents with badges and serious expressions that meant business. Behind them, she could glimpse reporters pushing closer, their cameras ready to capture whatever happened next. "James, the FBI is here. I'll be right over." Agent Sarah Mitchell was younger than Alyssa had expected, with kind eyes that had seen too much corporate corruption and a handshake that conveyed both authority and respect. Agent David Rodriguez looked like he could bench press a small car, but his voice was gentle when he explained why they were there. Miss Carter, we're here to discuss your willingness to testify in federal court against Richard Dalton and Dalton Enterprises. Based on the evidence you presented last night, we believe we can build a case for securities fraud, environmental crimes, bribery, and potentially racketeering. They sat at her small kitchen table, the same table where she had once eaten lonely dinners while reviewing Richard's lies. Now, that had become the headquarters for bringing him to justice. What would testifying involve, she asked. Agent Mitchell opened a thick folder that contained photographs, financial documents, and legal papers. Congressional hearings, federal court appearances, depositions that could last for weeks, media attention that will make last night look like a quiet evening at home. And if I don't testify? Agent Rodriguez's expression hardened. Then a man who has stolen millions, destroyed protected wetlands, and ruined countless lives walks away to do it again somewhere else. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. By afternoon, James had moved temporarily into her apartment to help manage the chaos. Reporters called every 15 minutes. Legal documents arrived by the hour. Patricia, David, Margaret, and Tony all confirmed their willingness to testify, their voices strong with the confidence of people who had finally found their courage. But the real test came at 6 p.m. when Alyssa agreed to her first television interview. The studio lights were hot enough to melt steel, and the interviewer, a woman whose smile never quite reached her calculating eyes, leaned forward like a predator scenting weakness. Miss Carter, some people are calling you a hero for exposing Richard Dalton's crimes. Others are saying you're a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. How do you respond to those accusations? Alyssa had practiced this moment with James, but sitting under the bright lights with millions of people watching felt like standing naked in Times Square. I respond by pointing to the evidence. The falsified environmental reports, the bribed officials, the investors who were about to lose billions on fraudulent deals. If seeking justice for those crimes makes me a disgruntled employee, then I accept that label. But you could have reported these crimes quietly through proper channels. Why the public humiliation? The question hit like a slap. Alyssa thought of all the proper channels that had failed the previous secretaries, all the quiet reports that had been buried, all the victims who have been silenced by money and power. Because proper channels don't work when the person you're reporting owns the people who are supposed to investigate him. Sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to drag him into the sunlight where everyone can see exactly what he is. The interviewer pressed harder. Richard Dalton built a company that employed hundreds of people. Many of them lost their jobs because of your actions. Do you feel responsible for their unemployment? This was the question that had been eating at her conscience since the ballroom. Real people with families and mortgages had been hurt by the company's collapse. I feel terrible for the innocent employees who were hurt, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. But I refuse to feel guilty for exposing crimes that would have eventually destroyed the company anyway. The difference is that now, those employees have legal protections and unemployment benefits instead of just unemployment and shame. After the interview, James found her crying in the green room. "Hey," he said, pulling her into his arms. "You did great. I keep thinking about Patricia and David and all the others. They trusted me, and now their lives are chaos too. They trusted you to do the right thing. And you did." That night, as they watched the late news coverage of congressional leaders calling for investigations, James's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number from Richard's legal team. "Don't answer it," Alyssa said. "I have to. It might be important." The voice on the other end was cold and professional. "Mr. Morrison, my client would like to arrange a meeting with Miss Carter. He has a proposition that might interest her." James's grip on the phone tightened. "Your client is facing federal charges. He needs to communicate through proper legal channels. He's willing to make this worth her while. Very worth her while." After James hung up, they sat in silence, both understanding what had just happened. Richard Dalton was trying to buy his way out of justice one more time. "How much do you think he offered?" Alyssa asked. "Does it matter?" She thought about the girl who had stepped off the Greyhound bus 8 months ago, desperate and broke and willing to do almost anything for financial security. That girl might have been tempted. "No," she said finally. "It doesn't matter at all." But as she fell asleep that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that Richard's next move would be far more dangerous than money. Desperate men do desperate things. But sometimes their desperation reveals the one truth they've been hiding all along. The knock on Alyssa's apartment door came at 11:47 p.m., 3 days after Richard's legal team had tried to buy her silence. She had been reviewing testimony notes with James when the soft but insistent tapping made them both freeze. Reporters had been camped outside her building for days, but they were loud and obvious. This knock was different, careful, deliberate, and somehow menacing in its restraint. "Expecting someone?" James whispered. Through the peephole, she saw a figure that made her blood turn to ice water. Richard Dalton stood in her hallway, but not the Richard she remembered from the office. This man looked like he had aged 10 years in a week. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his perfect hair disheveled, and his eyes held the wild brightness of someone who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. "Don't open it," James said, already reaching for his phone to call the police. But Richard's voice came through the door, soft and broken in a way that was somehow more terrifying than his usual roar. "Alyssa, please. I just want to talk. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." "He's not supposed to contact you directly," James whispered. "It violates his bail conditions." Another soft knock. "I know you're in there. I can see the lights. Please, Alyssa. I need to explain." Against every instinct in James's urgent head shaking, she opened the door but left the security chain attached. Through the narrow gap, she could see Richard's face clearly for the first time since the ballroom disaster. He looked destroyed. "5 minutes," she said, with the chain on and James recording everything. Richard's laugh was hollow. "Record away. I don't think I have anything left to hide." She opened the door fully, and he stepped into her small apartment like a ghost visiting the scene of his former life. His expensive cologne couldn't mask the smell of desperation and too much whiskey. "Nice place," he said, looking around her modest living room. "Cozy. Not like the penthouse, but then again, I don't have that anymore either." James positioned himself between Richard and Alyssa, his phone held high and recording everything. "What do you want, Richard?" she asked, using his first name for the first time in 8 months. "I want to understand." He sat down heavily on her small couch, looking older and smaller than she had ever seen him. "I've been trying to figure out how this happened. How a secretary from Alabama, Birmingham, he corrected with something that might have been a smile. How a secretary from Birmingham managed to destroy everything I spent 20 years building. "I didn't destroy anything. I just told people what you had already done." Richard's composure cracked like a broken dam. "Do you have any idea what you've cost me?" The investors pulled out. The banks called in their loans. My wife filed for divorce and took half of what was left. My own board of directors voted me out of the company I created. "Good," Alyssa said simply. The word hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Something dangerous and possessive that made James step closer to Alyssa. "You know what the strangest part is?" Richard continued, his voice taking on an odd, dreamy quality. "In all the years I've been in business, you're the only person who ever really impressed me. The only one who showed real intelligence, real courage, real strength." James's grip tightened on his phone. "You need to leave. Now." But Richard kept talking as if James weren't there, his attention focused entirely on Alyssa with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I've been thinking about you constantly since that night. About how magnificent you looked standing at that podium, destroying me with such perfect precision. I've never met anyone like you, Alyssa. Never met anyone worthy of the empire I built." The words sent ice through her veins. "You're scaring me, Richard. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to offer you everything." He reached into his jacket, and James tensed, ready to tackle him if necessary. But Richard only pulled out a small jewelry box. "I know this is unconventional," he said, opening the box to reveal a diamond ring that probably cost more than most people's houses. But conventional never got anyone anywhere important. Marry me, Alyssa. Help me rebuild. Together, we could create something even bigger than what we lost. The silence that followed was deafening. James looked like he wanted to throw Richard out the window. Alyssa stared at the ring, understanding finally hitting her like a freight train. This was never about business, she whispered. Was it? The late-night meetings, the impossible demands, the constant attention. You were never trying to break me. You were trying to possess me. Richard's smile was the most frightening thing she had ever seen. I knew you were special from the moment you walked into my office. Most people crumble under pressure, but you just got stronger. More beautiful. More perfect. James stepped forward, his voice deadly calm. Get out. Now. Before I call the police and have you arrested for violating your bail conditions and stalking. Richard stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Alyssa's face. Think about it. All the evidence you have, all the testimony you're planning, it goes away if you marry me. Spousal privilege. You couldn't testify against me even if you wanted to. That's not how it works legally, James snapped. Maybe not completely, Richard admitted, but would complicate things enough to give my lawyers room to work. We could disappear, Alyssa, start over somewhere new. Just the two of us. Alyssa looked at this broken, dangerous man who had terrorized her for months and felt something she hadn't expected. Pity. No, Richard. I wouldn't marry you if you were the last man on earth. His face went through a series of expressions. Hurt, rage, desperation, and finally something that looked almost like relief. I thought you'd say that, he said quietly, but I had to try. James was already calling 911 when Richard walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle and looked back one final time. You'll never find another man who appreciates your strength the way I do, he said. Most men are threatened by powerful women, but me? I've never wanted anything more than I want you. After he left, Alyssa sank onto the couch, her hands shaking with delayed reaction. James held her while they waited for the police, but she kept thinking about Richard's final words. He was wrong about everything, except one thing. She was powerful, and she was finally ready to use that power to finish what she had started. Some victories feel like endings. The best ones feel like beginnings. 6 months after the ballroom confrontation that destroyed Richard Dalton's empire, Alyssa stood in the corner office that had once been his, looking out at Manhattan with eyes that no longer saw an impossible city, but a conquered kingdom. The view hadn't changed, but everything else had. Dalton Enterprises had been restructured under new leadership, with Marcus Webb, Richard's former partner and moral compass, returning as CEO to clean up the mess. The Florida Wetlands Project had been canceled, the land donated to environmental protection groups, and the company had committed to funding the cleanup of damage from previous developments. And Alyssa Carter, former secretary from Birmingham, was now executive consultant for corporate ethics and employee relations, a position created specifically for her, with a salary that made her laugh every time she saw her bank balance. Feels strange, doesn't it? Patricia Williams asked from the doorway. The former bookkeeper was now chief financial officer, her silver hair styled with the confidence of someone who no longer had to fear for her job. What feels strange? Being the hero instead of the victim. Alyssa turned from the window, smiling at the woman who had been her first ally in the war against Richard's tyranny. I never wanted to be a hero. I just wanted him to stop hurting people. Mission accomplished. Patricia handed her a stack of letters from employees throughout the company. These came in today's mail. Thank you notes from people whose jobs you saved, whose harassment complaints are finally being heard, whose voices finally matter. The letters were beautiful and heartbreaking. Stories of employees who had been too afraid to speak up, too desperate to quit, too powerless to fight back. Now they had protection, respect, and most importantly, hope. Any word from David? Alyssa asked. He's thriving. The new IT security position suits him perfectly. Says he's never been happier to be boring and law-abiding. Patricia grinned. Margaret's loving her promotion to VP of Human Resources. She says it's nice to finally work for a company that cares about humans. And Tony, let me guess, he's telling everyone who will listen that he knew I was special from day one. Actually, He started a small consulting business helping other companies improve their employee relations. Turns out maintenance staff notice everything, and businesses are finally ready to listen. The success stories warmed Alyssa's heart, but they couldn't completely erase the shadow that still hung over her new life. Richard Dalton had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for securities fraud, environmental crimes, and bribery. Justice had been served, but justice felt different than she had expected. James found her an hour later, still standing at the window with a thoughtful expression that he had learned to recognize. "Brooding again?" he asked, sliding his arms around her waist from behind. "Thinking. Dangerous habit." He kissed her neck, and she leaned back against his chest, grateful for his warmth. "What about this time?" "Richard, the trial. All of it." She turned in his arms to face him. "I keep wondering if there was another way. Some path that didn't destroy so many lives." James studied her face with the intensity of someone who had fallen completely in love with both her strength and her compassion. "You mean a path that let him keep victimizing people?" "Of course not. But you have a conscience, and that makes you question everything, even when you did the right thing." He cupped her face in his hands. "That conscience is exactly why you were the right person to stop him. Someone without empathy might have gone too far. Someone without strength would never have gone far enough." The engagement ring on her finger caught the afternoon sunlight, sending rainbow sparkles across the office walls. James had proposed 3 months ago, not with Richard's vulgar display of wealth and possession, but with a simple, elegant ring and a proposal that centered on partnership, respect, and love. "Speaking of which," he continued, "the wedding planner called. She needs to know about the guest list." Their wedding was planned for the spring, in Birmingham, where Alyssa's parents could walk her down the aisle without having to travel to a city that still intimidated them. It would be small, intimate, and focused on the future rather than the past. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "I want to invite Marcus to give a toast. And Patricia, David, Margaret, and Tony should all be in the wedding party." "What about your former boss?" The question hung in the air between them. Richard was serving his sentence in a minimum security facility in Pennsylvania, his appeals exhausted and his empire completely dismantled. "No," she said finally. "That chapter of my life is closed." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Richard Dalton had shaped her in ways she was still discovering, not through his cruelty, but through her response to it. He had tried to break her, and instead had forged her into something stronger than she ever imagined possible. "Any regrets?" James asked. She thought about the scared girl who had stepped off the Greyhound bus 18 months ago, desperate for any job that would pay the bills. That girl had been looking for security, for someone to take care of her, for a place to hide from the world's harshness. This woman, the woman she had become, didn't need anyone to take care of her. She was perfectly capable of taking care of herself and anyone else who needed protection. "None," she said, a minute completely. Outside the window, Manhattan pulsed with its usual energy, but it no longer seemed impossible to conquer. After all, she had already proven that even the mightiest empires could fall when challenged by someone brave enough to speak the truth. The future stretched ahead of them like an open road, full of possibilities that the scared girl from Birmingham never could have imagined. Some love stories begin with meet cuties and stolen glances. The best ones begin with shared battles and mutual respect. The morning of Alyssa Carter's wedding dawned clear and bright over Birmingham, Alabama, painting the sky in shades of hope that seemed personally designed for her happiness. She stood in her childhood bedroom, looking out at the same view that had seemed so limiting 18 months ago, and marveled at how perspective could transform everything. The girl who had left this room with $200 in a desperate dream was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had toppled a corporate empire, testified before Congress, and turned a moment of public humiliation into a masterclass in personal power. "You ready, sweetheart?" Her father appeared in the doorway, resplendent in the new suit that James had insisted on buying him. Robert Carter had spent his life directing church choirs and teaching Sunday school, but today he looked like he could conduct symphonies and council presidents. More ready than I've ever been for anything, she replied, adjusting her simple but elegant dress. Nothing like the ostentatious gown Richard would have chosen for his imagined bride, but perfect for a woman who had learned that real beauty came from authenticity, not display. The church was filled with faces that told the story of her transformation. Her mother dabbed tears from her eyes in the front pew, flanked by James's parents who had welcomed Alyssa into their family with the same warmth their son had shown during her darkest hours. Patricia Williams looked radiant in her role as matron of honor, while David Chun, Margaret Foster, and Tony Rodriguez formed James's groomsmen party, an unlikely but perfect collection of corporate warriors who had learned that courage was contagious. Marcus Webb sat in the second row, the man who had tried to warn Richard away from his destructive path and who now served as the ethical compass for the reform company. His presence felt like a benediction on all the pain that had led to this moment of pure joy. Dearly beloved, the minister began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had married her parents 35 years earlier. We are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have learned that the strongest partnerships are built not on need, but on choice. James stood at the altar in his navy suit, his eyes never leaving her face as she walked down the aisle to a future that felt as solid as the ground beneath her feet. When he took her hands, she felt the calluses from his law books and late-night research sessions. Hands that had helped her build the case that brought down Richard's empire and built their own foundation of trust. The vows they had written together were simple and direct, like everything else in their relationship. James, she said, her voice clear and strong, you taught me the difference between power used to control and power used to protect. You showed me that real love doesn't demand submission. It inspires strength. I promise to be your partner in every battle worth fighting, your comfort in every storm worth weathering, and your celebration in every victory worth winning. Alyssa, he replied, his voice thick with emotion, you are the bravest person I've ever known. You took on an empire and won. But more importantly, you did it without losing your compassion or your integrity. I promise to support your dreams, celebrate your victories, and stand beside you as an equal in whatever adventures our future holds. During the reception, held in the same church fellowship hall where Alyssa had learned to play piano as a child, Patricia raised her champagne glass for a toast that brought tears to every eye in the room. To Alyssa and James, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed miracles firsthand. Two people who proved that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living so well that your enemies become irrelevant. The celebration continued late into the evening, with Marcus Webb regaling guests with stories of corporate reform and Tony Rodriguez teaching James's law school friends how to properly fix a leaky faucet. But the moment Alyssa would remember most came when David Chun pulled her aside with news that made her heart skip a beat. Alyssa, I thought you should know. I got a call from the prison yesterday. Her blood turned cold. Richard? No, the warden. Richard Dalton died in his sleep Tuesday night. Natural causes, they said. Heart attack. The news hit her like a physical blow, not of grief, but of finality. The man who had terrorized her dreams for months, who had tried to own her soul and destroy her spirit, was gone. The chapter was truly, completely closed. How do I feel about this? She asked, more to herself than to David. However you want to, he replied gently. There's no right way to react when someone who hurt you dies. She stood in the church fellowship hall, surrounded by people who loved her and a husband who respected her, and realized that she felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not grief, not relief. Richard Dalton had simply become irrelevant to her happiness. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. Later that night, in the hotel suite that James had booked for their wedding night, she told him about Richard's death. Any regrets? He asked, the same question he had posed months earlier. She thought about the scared secretary who had once cleaned coffee stains from a conference room wall, about the woman who had stood at a podium and chosen truth over safety, about the future that stretched ahead of them like an open road. None, she said, and kissed her husband with the passion of someone who had learned that the best victories weren't about destroying enemies, They were about building something beautiful from the ashes of what tried to destroy you. Richard Dalton was dead, but Alyssa Carter Morrison was just beginning to live. She went to New York to climb the ladder. Instead, she built her own building. 5 years after the ballroom confrontation that changed her life forever, Alyssa Carter Morrison stood in her corner office overlooking Manhattan, but not the same corner office where she had once filed papers and fetched coffee for a monster. This office was in her own building, with her name on the door and her vision driving every decision made within its walls. Morrison Carter Consulting had grown from a 2-person operation to a 50-employee firm specializing in corporate ethics, environmental compliance, and employee protection. The company's mission statement, framed on her desk next to a photo of her wedding day, read simply, "Truth, justice, dignity, for everyone." Mrs. Morrison, her assistant, a sharp young woman named Rachel Martinez, appeared in the doorway with the kind of respectful energy that Alyssa had once wished for in her own career. "Your 2 o'clock appointment is here." The appointment was with Sarah Chun, a secretary from a major pharmaceutical company who had discovered her employer was hiding dangerous side effects from a new medication. Sarah looked exactly like Alyssa had 5 years earlier, scared, desperate, and carrying a folder of evidence that could change everything. "Tell me what happened," Alyssa said, gesturing to the comfortable chairs by the window, where sunlight streamed in like a promise of better days ahead. For the next hour, she listened to a story that was heartbreakingly familiar. A powerful man exploiting his position, silencing opposition through intimidation, and putting profits ahead of people's lives. But this time, Alyssa wasn't the victim. She was the cavalry. "What are my options?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking with the same fear that had once consumed Alyssa's nights. "You have more options than you realize," Alyssa replied, opening her laptop to show Sarah the network of lawyers, journalists, and federal investigators that Morrison Carter Consulting had cultivated over the years. "And more support than you know." By the end of the meeting, Sarah walked out with a legal team, a media strategy, and most importantly, the knowledge that she wasn't alone. Watching her leave with straight shoulders and determined steps reminded Alyssa why she had built this company in the first place. "Another David and Goliath story?" James asked when he arrived to pick her up for dinner. Her husband had made partner at his law firm the previous year, specializing in corporate whistleblower cases, and their professional collaboration had only deepened their personal partnership. Something like that. She gathered her purse and the files for tomorrow's congressional hearing on pharmaceutical industry regulation, though I prefer to think of it as another Alyssa Carter story. Modest as always, they walked through Manhattan's evening bustle, 2 people who had learned that the city's harsh exterior hid countless opportunity for those brave enough to seize them. The restaurant James had chosen was a small Italian place where they had celebrated their first major case victory, back when Morrison Carter Consulting operated out of a cramped office above a deli. "Any word from Birmingham?" James asked over wine that no longer seemed impossibly expensive. "Mom called this morning. Dad's choir is performing at the state competition next month. She wants to know if we'll be there." "Will we?" Alyssa smiled, thinking of her parents who had watched their daughter transform from a scared girl to a woman who testified before Congress and appeared on magazine covers as one of America's top corporate ethics consultants. They still lived in the same modest house, still attended the same small church, but now they spoke with quiet pride about their daughter who had changed corporate America. "Wouldn't miss it. Besides, I'm giving a speech at the University of Alabama next week about corporate responsibility. Might as well make it a full Southern tour." The university speech was part of a lecture series Alyssa had developed, traveling to colleges across the country to tell her story and inspire the next generation of ethical business leaders. The audiences were always filled with young women who saw in her proof that background didn't determine destiny. Courage did. Speaking of speeches, James said, reaching across the table to take her hand, "I have something to tell you." The tone in his voice made her heart flutter with anticipation. After 5 years of marriage, she had learned to recognize the difference between his casual conversation voice and his big news voice. "Tell me." Patricia called today. The environmental legislation inspired by the Florida case passed its final Senate vote. The Wetlands Protection Act is going to be signed into law next month. The news hit her like a wave of pure joy. The legislation had been years in the making, born from the evidence she had presented in that ballroom and nurtured through countless congressional hearings, expert testimonies, and advocacy campaigns. Richard's wetlands will never be built on, she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. No, and neither will thousands of others. Your courage saved them all. That night, as they walked home through streets that had once seemed impossibly intimidating, Alyssa thought about the journey that had brought her here. A scared girl from Birmingham had become a woman who shaped federal legislation. A secretary who filed papers had become a CEO who filed lawsuits. A victim who cleaned coffee stains had become a victor who cleaned up corporate corruption. Any regrets? James asked, their traditional question that had become a private joke. She looked up at their apartment building. Not the small place where she had once lived in fear, but a spacious home filled with wedding photos, legal awards, and plans for the family they hoped to start soon. Just one, she said. What's that? I wish I could go back and tell that girl in the Greyhound bus what was waiting for her in New York. I wish I could tell her that the worst day of her life would become the first day of her real life. James squeezed her hand. She wouldn't have believed you. No, Alyssa agreed, smiling up at the Manhattan skyline that now belonged to her as much as anyone else. She would have thought it was impossible. But impossible, she had learned, was just another word for something that hadn't been done yet. And Alyssa Carter Morrison had spent the last 5 years making the impossible look easy. The empire she had brought down was gone forever, but the empire she had built in its place would last for generations. Because it wasn't built on fear, exploitation, or cruelty. It was built on truth. And truth, unlike lies, had no expiration date. If this story inspired you to find your own voice, remember this. The secretary they underestimated became the CEO they couldn't ignore. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And sometimes, the person everyone thinks is powerless holds all the power they never saw coming. The girl from Birmingham had conquered Manhattan. But more importantly, she had conquered herself.